Okay. All right, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. This is a special webinar. It's Dr. Brad and I's first webinar together, and we have been talking about doing this for years, several years, and I don't know what has stopped us, but Dr. Brad and I met in 2010 when I first started at naturopathic medical school in Seattle. He was my philosophy teacher. And then throughout, I was actually at Bastyr for 6 years getting my doctorate because I also got a master's in acupuncture. And so it took a long time for me to finish my schooling. And Dr. Brad, during that time, taught several courses that I took, including philosophy and counseling and biofeedback. We were never on a shift together,
No,
unfortunately, because of acupuncture, but
but we
he
have
was
worked
there.
together.
And then we worked together. So after I graduated, many of you might know this, some definitely do not know this. I worked at 40 Years of Zen, which was started by Dave Asprey, who is the founder of Bulletproof Coffee, Bulletproof Diet. So he started this neurofeedback center, and Dr. Brad had been doing neurofeedback and biofeedback already for many years. And
Yeah. Wild.
once I started there, to be completely honest, was in a little bit over my head as the head facilitator there. And I convinced my boss to hire Brad. And so Dr. Brad came on and we co-facilitated several groups together at 40 Years of Zen in Seattle, which was amazing. And basically, long story short, I will go through a little bit of his bio for you, and he'll have to just sit through that. But basically, he's been incredibly inspiring to me. And I realized that a lot of what I do in my practice is inspired by what he has taught me. And so I wanted to, and he continues to be the person that I go to when I feel overwhelmed, or I feel like, in the practice of medicine, you often feel like you're just never doing enough, or you feel like you're not doing the right thing, right? So someone comes in with fatigue and there's literally 50 different things you could do for them. And so cutting through all of that noise and getting to the core issue is really important, especially as a naturopathic or integrative doctor. And Dr. Brad helps me stay on track. And one reason why it's so compelling to me, the work that he does, is because I feel like it's very easy to know the medicine. So like knowing the prescription for the disease, knowing the supplement and what it does, knowing which diet is, like a lot of people know that, and a lot of doctors, that's not the hard part. The hard part is actually connecting to the person and inspiring them and motivating them to change. And that's always the elephant in the room, is how do we actually get to the core of this issue for this individual sitting in front of us. And so Dr. Brad is really adept at that. And yeah, I'm not going to read his bio actually, because I just want to get into it. So he's a naturopathic physician. He's been practicing for over 25 years. He's been professor and clinical faculty at Bastyr Center for Natural Health. He has been teaching biofeedback shifts, counseling. He teaches in the psychology degree program, the acupuncture program, and the naturopathic doctorate program at Bastyr. Outside of that, he also has been in private practice seeing patients. He's done a lot of end-of-life care, which is really profound work, and guided God knows how many thousands of people through meditations and biofeedback sessions. So what did I miss, Dr. Brad? Is there anything that you want to say?
No, that's all. That's good enough. Thank you. That's good enough. Yeah.
Okay, so let's get into it. So this webinar is called Navigating Uncertainty, or Navigating Life in Uncertain Times, and dealing, how to find peace within ourselves during this pandemic. There is so much uncertainty in the world, and basically where I want to start, I want to give you guys a lot of actionable stuff that you can take home and hopefully will change your life as it has mine. But first I want to educate on mind-body medicine and the science behind what happens when we are faced with uncertainty. And a lot of you on this webinar are going to be familiar with, terms like cortisol and the stress response and fight or flight. And those terms get thrown around, but it's not always accurate. And that's actually not how everyone responds when they're feeling unsafe. So I'll just kind of frame it that way, and then I'll let Dr. Brad take it from there and speak a little bit more to the science of mind-body medicine and the science of stress and uncertainty.
Okay. Let me begin. I mean, in hearing that overview, let me begin by just talking about the nervous system, because I think that's an important place to start, rather than talking about mind-body medicine, because I'll get into that. Our nervous system wants predictability. It wants certainty. It wants routine. So that's actually the first thing to know, that our routines have been upended, right? Our work life has been upended, our social life, our emotional output, the way we make connection, the things that we do all the time, that's now up in the air. And that's creating all kinds of havoc for people. And we don't even know what's going to happen with the economy. See, notice as I even say these things, what happens in your body. You know, it's like I do this to my patients all the time. I do this to the students all the time. I always just bring up student loans just to see what happens in their body, or practice, or, you know, your investments, just to notice what happens. So our nervous system wants predictability, and it's hardwired to make that predictability because the nervous system's our master regulator. It keeps our breathing going when we're not thinking about it. It keeps our hormonal system going. It keeps our pH, our temperature, our heart beating. And so it wants this predictability. And in these uncertain times, we don't feel any safety. And that's the word I use. And I use that word a lot to my patients. And just this morning, I had a patient I was working with who said something about, like, I'm safe. You know, I've got a good home. I do, I'm not worried about my job. But then what it came down to is this person, and I hear this from a lot of people, didn't feel productive. You know, I have to keep going and doing things, or I'm not worthwhile. And that's another issue of safety. If I'm not worthwhile, if I'm not meaningful in my life, then I don't matter. It's not safe. So when I use this word safety that the nervous system is looking for, it's really about all of that. It's about emotional safety, intellectual safety, physical safety. And so as you were talking about earlier, you mentioned cortisol. The very first thing we as mammals do is mobilize. And I pull back from using the fight or flight term because it's been used so much. I talk about mobilize because that's what we're doing. We're trying to mobilize our energy so that we can do something to address what we're not feeling safe about. So some of that is rumination, right? So we mobilize, and that's what secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine and cortisol. And what most doctors, until recently, what most doctors will say is, like, the main problem in healthcare is an overactive sympathetic nervous system and all that cortisol production, because it actually impacts our immune system. It doesn't shut it down. That's incorrect. It shifts it, and then we can't fight infection. We have more allergic reactions and other things. But that's the first thing. So going back, the very first thing that mammals do is we mobilize. And some of us do that, right? Like at 3 o'clock in the morning. What are we mobilizing against? You know, planning your future. If it's really an important plan and leads to something, great. But most of us are just mobilizing, getting stuck in a loop. And what I'm seeing with a lot of people now too is the second phase. That's what happens first. But then when that system gets overwhelmed, or when we think that there's no escape of it and the nervous system can't do it anymore, it shuts down. And so that's another trauma response. That's another exhaustion response. We just shut down. And it's not sympathetic. It's actually parasympathetic. It's an old archaic branch of the vagus nerve that goes to the heart and lungs and causes your heart rate to drop, your blood pressure to drop. It causes your digestion to shut down. It's a very similar thing for those of you who, like, when you see a needle, you want to pass out. That's what's happening. Your whole nervous system and blood pressure drop. What also happens is your prefrontal cortex, your neocortex, goes offline. It's not functioning, so you can't think clearly. In the sympathetic response, you can't think really clearly either, because you're just focusing on one thing and you can't see the bigger picture. And then when you're in this this immobilization, that's what we call it, immobilization response. You can't think either. And that's what reptiles do, that's what mice do, that's what possums do. So you've seen that before. Your breathing stops, sometimes you hold your breath for a long time. And neither of those are a healing response, and both of those are a stress response, if you want to use that word stress.
Mm-hmm. And is there a continuum, Dr. Brad, between
Mm.
when we feel under threat, whether we're conscious of it or not, right? Because like you said, often we're not even conscious that we're
Yes.
going down this pattern. We're actually, we catch it at the end when we've already reacted. Can someone go into immobilization and they start, what is called the fight or flight, and they go into mobilization, and then if that doesn't work, they go into immobilization?
There's a lot that's there's a lot that's written about this, and I'm hearing different theorists talk about which can happen. People can have a predominant one. People can learn early on in life that they just need to shut down. I'm thinking about some of my patients who are physically abused by parents and have said, "Don't cry or I'll give you something to cry about," and they just shut down. So, but there is a continuum, and I want to say the part that's really important here is it's about safety. You and I are mobilizing right now. We're listening. We're engaged. That's the next response. We're engaged, but I'm mobilizing because I'm talking and I'm getting excited. So my sympathetic nervous system is working, but I feel safe. And because I feel safe with this, I don't have any of the deleterious aspects of that sympathetic. I'm not secreting the cortisol levels the same way. My heart rate might go up and my breathing might go up, but my blood pressure, my blood vessels aren't constricting the same way. So that's really important. And then when we go to sleep at night, if we sleep, that's an immobilization. There are times that we immobilize. If you're going to go have the thing I think about dental work, I have to immobilize. And yes, I get that stress response, but then I can settle into that immobilization knowing that I'm safe. And that's what I do. I actually practice reminding myself I'm safe, hopefully I'm safe. So is it a continuum? Some people talk about the way Stephen Porges, who developed the polyvagal theory, he did talk about it phylogenetically. He talked about reptiles do this parasympathetic response, then mammals do the mobilization response. But humans, I believe, the very first thing we do is mobilize. That's what we learn. But if that gets shut down, then we learn to immobilize. And classic stories are of car accidents, when there's a passenger in the car and then there's a driver. If the driver sees it happening and they start to steer the wheel, they're mobilizing. And many times their PTSD symptoms will present as chronic mobilization. The passenger, on the other hand, who can't do anything, will tell you they black out. They'll tell you, I saw the car in front of me and I don't remember anything else. And that's because they went into immobilization. And they'll have post-fact many of those immobilization symptoms. Mm-hmm. And the key thing for practitioners to remember, and actually anybody listening, all of us to remember, which is the first compassionate exercise, is to realize that when we start to mobilize and we start to immobilize, that's our adaptive response. To beat yourself up and go, I know better. Why am I not doing this? I know better. I say that's cruel. that's an act of lack of kindness, and it doesn't let you off the hook. I keep saying this to people. It doesn't give you a free clear, oh yeah, go and do whatever you're doing. But it does say, well, I'm responding that way. And it's like what you said, like these can be automatic reactions that we're not consciously aware of. It's not about conscious awareness. I think about, well, I don't have a problem with blood draws, but I'm thinking about heights. I know when I'm on the top of a building, a gust of wind is not going to pick me up and throw me over the edge, which is what's going on in my mind. I know that's not going to happen, but my body's still responding. So it's not about intellect and talking yourself out of it at times.
Yeah. And I think that for me, when I understood that and started studying the nervous system in this way, it takes a layer of responsibility out and at the same time, you're still responsible for your actions. Yes. And there was a whole like aha moment for me that was like, wow, this is just how my body has learned to adapt because it worked at some point. And it's not a failing of me being smart enough or spiritual enough or mature enough, or like you mentioned, compassion, then having compassion and saying, okay, this is my nervous system acting. And you stop getting identified as your nervous system. It's like, I am not my nervous system necessarily. I can watch my nervous system and I can say, wow, look at how my body feels that it needs to respond right now. But it takes this level. For me, I was putting a lot of guilt on myself. You've done so much spiritual work and you lived in India for a year and you've meditated for 17 years. Why aren't you just over this already? Like, why do you still get activated? And there was a lot of beating myself up about just what you said. I know intellectually there's no reason for me to feel unsafe in certain scenarios, and yet I still do.
Oh, and I'm sure everyone on this and everyone listening to this can identify that. I know this, I've done this, I should know better.
Yeah.
And I think this is the deleterious side, a negative side of mind-body medicine. Mind-body medicine, the way the NIH and the NCAM and the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health have defined it, is it's really just an approach of looking at the whole person. And the goal of mind-body medicine is not to fix a problem. It's not like to cure cancer or to eradicate IBS or what it's about is looking at how you want to interact with that. How do you want the word I use from trauma work is orient. How do you want to orient to these things? And people who practice mind-body medicine are coaches and guides. We're not the person to fix it. And so it's that itself is a cognitive reframe that changes my work. But what I was saying is the downside of that is there's a lot of people, and I do take issue with this, who talk about positive thinking. And I am all for positive affirmations. But a lot of times what I see in positive thinking is that it comes back and bites us because people say, just like you did, I've been meditating all these years. I should be able to do this. Or if I think positively, I can cure myself from cancer. If I think positively, like if the house collapses on you, it's not going to land on you, or you can prevent it from happening. It's called collapsing the fields. It's like, I may know that this wall is all empty space because people tell me that in physics. I still haven't seen anybody walk through it yet because you're not spiritual enough. Yeah. And so that, I think that's an important point about there's a lot of self-judgment and blame of I'm just not doing, I'm going to say another word that triggers me. I'm not biohacking myself right. I more cold baths and infrared saunas, and then now I will have no problem. And then my comment to those people who talk about this is like, well, I should avoid this food and that food. I was like, well, wait a minute. If you're so developed, and if it's all positive thinking, don't think that you're not going to react to those foods anymore.
Right.
So that's the downside, I think, of that. And it's going back to what you said is you talked about two things. Mindfulness, you said, I can watch my nervous system. I can just watch it. Wow. And then you said the compassion part of, I'm okay. This is what's happening for me.
Yeah. And it's funny because, of course, I've been reading and practicing, acceptance, right? This word acceptance. And what I found was really powerful so this kind of all started because 2 weeks ago I was doing a really big podcast and I was like overwhelmingly, totally illogically nervous about doing this podcast. And part of it was because I had done an interview before and it didn't go well. And I was in some personal health stuff had happened to me that very day. And then I did this interview. And
I'm going to interrupt you. I'm going to pause you because I just want to address that. You said it didn't go well.
Yeah.
Don't even know what that means.
No. And actually, when I look back at it, I think there was a lot of self-judgment there for probably no reason, but I'm
sorry. I cut your flow off.
No, you cut me off. No, I got it. So I reached out because I felt my whole system shut down. Like everything, I was shaking from nervousness. I mean, I was I don't know that I've ever felt that level of stress and like that intensely. And again, logically, I knew that it was fine, but I felt so unsafe. And then after you and I spoke, I had this moment of like, I can both feel stressed and have compassion for myself. And when I practice, so I made a promise to myself that I was going to spend 15 minutes a day just doing self-compassion. And it
Mm.
totally shifted. I was still nervous when I started the podcast. But about 5 minutes into it, I was like, no matter, I knew from feeling that no matter what happened, it would be okay. And before I logically knew that, but without that practice of
Mm.
feeling and telling my nervous system it was going to be okay. So I guess my point is just to your point, there's no thinking your way out of this. There's no amount of like, if I just think better, or I mean, thinking has a part to play for sure, but there's no amount of, if I could just logically understand this, then it would go away. It's like the prefrontal cortex and the emotional brain don't have very many connections.
Yeah.
For evolutionary purpose.
And the interesting thing about that, that I point out to patients, and some of you have heard of adverse childhood events. So they're the ACEs. They're the events that happen between third trimester and 18 years of life. And the more adverse childhood events, and they fall into different categories like abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. And under each of those, there's many different kinds. But they're about 10. The more you have, the more it affects your nervous system. It affects your neurodevelopment. And some of you have heard about attachment theory, and that takes a step back. So that's usually, we're talking about the third trimester to the first 3 years of life. The reason this is so critical, this isn't some ephemeral thing, ethereal thing. Cortisol is neurotoxic to the developing brain. So depending on when your childhood events, so when we talk about the third trimester, if your mother is in a war zone or suffering from famine, she's secreting extra glucocorticoids. That's trauma. So what happens is that cortisol, depending on when it's flooding your brain during your development and maturation, could prevent the hippocampus from developing, from myelinating. It prevents hippocampal connections and dendrites forming. It can, as you were saying, the corpus callosum, it can impact the development of the corpus callosum, which means then, since there are already not that many pathways, connections, you can't integrate your conscious cognitive thinking with your limbic system. And so it makes that more problematic. So when people say, why am I so reactive? Again, it's not blaming our parents. The Jew in me loves to do the East Coast. I learned about this and I said, Mom, now I can blame you. Look, this is what happened. But it's not about that. It's just saying, these things happen to me. No, okay, this is how my body adapted. This is what the issue is. Again, it's a level, I think, of freedom and compassion. That's how I like to think of it. And as a practitioner, if anybody's a practitioner, and you sit there and say, why doesn't this patient, oh God, why, come on, guys, just change your diet. Don't eat that when you're stressed. Why are you doing that when you're stressed? For any of us, we go, oh, that's their adaptive response. They don't feel safe. Okay. Now I understand.
And that I want to go down this road and ask you this question, because so much of talk therapy and so much of the therapy that most of people in the world get is talk therapy. That's what they have access to, and that's what most therapists are trained in. And so if these things happen to us, however you want to view that early on, and it is our nervous system responding to what and how it was developed, how important is it to go back and relive your past and analyze your past and talk about your past? I know it's kind of a leading question, but I really am curious to know your perspective on how important is it to know your story, and what do you do with patients? Do you have them reiterate traumas in their past? Do you have them talk about it, and do you find that effective?
Great question. I like that question. I think that's a really important thing, because What you and I just did is we provided, and you said this at the very onset, you want to educate. So I think most of my work is education, because the education isn't telling people what to think. It's not processing it and going through it and reliving it. What it's doing is saying, okay, here's a context, a framework to put everything on. And then you can look at your own life and your own behavior and map it onto that and go, oh, that's a cognitive reframe. Instead of doing cognitive behavioral therapy directly, saying that thought is dysfunctional, change it, you sit there and say, oh, it's my neurobiological adaptive response. That's the word I use. It's my neurobiological adaptive response. That's why I'm acting that way. And then I can choose to have compassion. One of the downsides of talk therapy, and this has been written about by many people who do trauma work, is that what it can do is re-traumatize us. And I've seen this in my office numerous times. For me as a practitioner, I'm curious. I'm also just a curious person. I'm interested in hearing a person's narrative and how, not just for the details, but how they orient to it. When they talk about it, how do they respond? The downside about talking about trauma or past experiences is they're not stored in somebody who's had a traumatic experience as this whole integrated piece. What happens in trauma is often our memories get stored as implicit memory. So not explicit memory, autobiographical memory where you go, oh, I was here on Thursday at this time. So when we start to talk about our experience, we can get flooded easily because an image can come to mind, but because it's not fully integrated, all of a sudden we have that response. It's similar to the old classic story about people who hear the car backfire and they're on the ground. That's procedural memory, motor memory. They just are instantly there before they had time to think about it. So I ask people to just consider the life events that have happened to them. I'm starting to do something I did with you guys. I don't know if I did with you when you were a student in the philosophy class. It's a psychospiritual autobiography. I give people this. I have them draw a timeline from their birth to whatever age they are. And above it, they put all these events they consider positive. Yes, that's a judgmental perspective, but what they consider positive and what they consider negative. And I have them draw the line about it so that they can start to see that, one, their whole life hasn't just been negative most of the time. And then from that, we could start to say what they did and their behaviors, but they're not reliving. The point of that is it's more of a creative, artistic process, so they're not reliving that experience. So I tell my patients about ACEs. I tell them about the neurobiological adaptive response, and then I let them tell me what they need to, because what I want to know is, how is the nervous system orienting? How is it hardwired now? Do they mobilize or immobilize? Those are the broad strokes. And under what circumstances? And then I ask them, can they identify how they want to respond? You know what? As a practitioner, you ask people, how do you want to be? And they'll say, well, I don't want to be anxious. Well, I don't want to be scared. Well, how would you like to be? I don't want to be that. And they can't tell you. And Carl Jung even said the main disease is lack of imagination. So we have to help people. So I want to say one more thing about your question. There was, I believe it's the Bosnian refugee study. I have it somewhere. But in the study, there were refugees who were in the camps, and they separated them into two groups. And they said, this group, you're going to tell your story to a biographer. They're going to write your story so everybody else in the world will know about what happened to you. And then the other group, they said, you're going to see a psychologist to process your trauma. Little did they know that the people who they were working with were all psychologists. But that shift in orientation, you're going to tell my story, and let people know, gave them a sense of agency. I didn't have to process it. I don't have to deal with it. I know I have an affect, which is a little, you can infer what I'm saying there. So they told their story as a way of saying, here, this is helping. It gave them, as I said, agency, self-efficacy, and they told their story, and they, in the study, had less PTSD symptoms than the other group that processed it. And PTSD, prolonged PTSD, some symptoms of continuing rumination of this, and then just all this emotional discharge that kept coming up, and reactivity that didn't happen. So we're a culture that likes to talk. I do, as you can tell. But a lot of times when we talk about what our story, do we really need to go into all the details? Many times we think nobody else will understand. But that's about not feeling safe because we don't feel connected, and that gets to another aspect. But
yeah, and it feels to me in the work that even in talking to patients about their physical health and mental health with the therapy that I do, people would rather, it's because it's safer to think about how they feel rather than feel how they feel. So it's almost like we have these canned responses that we, and of course there's the, hey, how you doing? Fine, thanks. There's that. But then that actually speaks to something greater, which is when I'm with someone and I'm like, how does that feel? And they immediately have a response. I know they didn't check in, because there is this disconnect. And so I think that we do have, maybe it's cultural, maybe it's for safety, but we do have this kind of, I will go through my day and at the end of the day realize I haven't felt my body like all day, like that I've not actually, I have been up here. And because I have the experience of meditating, I know what it feels like, to check in with my body. But the more and I'm still thinking through this myself of it really does feel like, it sounds cliche, but it really does feel like just going into the feeling is more relieving than just talking about it ad nauseum, because we're so scared to feel it. But then when you actually do feel it, it doesn't have as much weight as you think it does.
And emotion, the word emotion, French word émouvoir, it meant to move out. The emotion's a conduit, like, what am I feeling? Where am I feeling? Just checking in. How many of us feel pain in our body because we're at the computer all day? Well, if we really checked in, we would align our posture much differently if we were aware. But no, this is more important, so I'm focusing on that more. And also,
I wonder if this is a good time to. I actually don't know what you think about this, the top down versus bottom up conversation. Okay. And I would love for you to explain that, and because I think it's really interesting.
Well, top down, for those who don't know, top down means we change our thoughts, it changes our emotions, changes our body. And this is where the education piece comes in. It really does. Like if somebody says, oh, I didn't know that. Oh, well, now I'm not afraid. That can happen at times. Like you move into a new house and all of a sudden you're hearing something. Oh, what is that? What is it? It's like, oh, it's the refrigerator. Oh, that's the sound of the refrigerator. Your nervous system picks it up. But once you know it's the refrigerator, you go, oh, okay, I'm safe. Yeah. Top down. If everything was that simple. The bottom up, really, the bottom up approach is change your body, change the way you breathe, change your posture. Your nervous system will change and you'll be less responsive to things. And you might orient differently. Everyone, I don't know if everyone, many people have had that experience. You get a massage, a really good massage, and then all of a sudden you like people more. Okay, maybe that's too much about me. No, you know what you've had a really good meal. You've had some really lovely sensory experience. You've slept, and all of a sudden your outlook is different. Then you break your ankle, and then all of a sudden your mood has changed again. So the bottom up also changes. And how I talk about it is like, what's an emotion? Now, there's many ways to debate what emotions are. I think emotions are predictions. Lisa Feldman Barrett's book. But I've been talking about that for a long time. But the way I talk about it with my biofeedback patients are, get mad at me. Get really mad at me, but don't tense a muscle and don't think anything about me. So, and then I haven't found anybody who can yet. So they'd have to tense their muscles and then, or they have to think, what an idiot, he's just. But do you notice every thought has a physical reaction? And even if I just asked everybody who's watching this to tighten up, clench their jaw, and do this for 5 minutes, you're going to feel a different way, and you're going to start looking at things differently. So this is why I think massage, craniosacral, but yoga, movement, breath work, all of those things help. And if I can go a little further on that, we talked about mobilization and immobilization, but what Stephen Porges talks about is the healing orienting response is social engagement. He calls it social engagement. I call it engagement because it's also about our relationship to ourselves. Mm. But he's really talking about in a community way. When I'm connected to you, I feel safe. If I don't feel safe, I'm not going to connect to you. It works both ways. And what happens is that sense of connection, when I feel really connected, she's listening, she cares about me, it regulates my ventral vagus, my vagus nerve, 10th cranial nerve. It affects my heart, it affects my respiration, but it comes out of the nucleus ambiguus in the brain stem. And it comes out of an area where there's 5 other cranial nerves, cranial nerve 5, 7, 9, 10, vagus, and 11, spinal accessory. And what I tell my students is that's everything you need to know about mind-body medicine. That's all you need to know about health. Because the combination of those muscles, or those nerves, innervate the muscles of our face, our larynx, our throat, and even our posture and our breath. So breath work is going to change it. But how I'm talking, the way my facial expressions are, if I'm immobilized, I'm going to have a flat affect. My voice is going to be monotone. If I'm in mobilization, I get up and, but everything gets energized and my heart rate goes up. And when I'm engaged with someone, if I'm trying to soothe an infant or soothe my kittens, or have a conversation that's even difficult with someone that I care about, but I'm a little bit nervous about, if I want to engage, I can't talk to them like this. I can't say this. There's a wonderful study that showed bosses. They were looking at bosses and the regulation of the employee's nervous system. And the bosses that spoke like this and really direct, and I'm just telling you the facts, their employees had poor regulation and poorer health than the people who said, okay, I know this is difficult to say. They're regulating their intonation of their voice. They're regulating the muscles of their face. Mm-hmm. That's what we need to know, right?
And me as a receiver, I'm mirroring that. So when someone speaks to me and I can see that they're breathing and I can see that their facial muscles are, contentment, or that there's not anger, right? And that it's safe for me to be engaged with them, then I regulate myself.
Right. So if I'm saying, I really love you.
Don't buy it.
Yeah. And we don't. And this is the thing. We think it's intuition, or we go like, I just get a sense. You do get a sense. When people say, oh, my gut's telling me, your gut is telling you something. It can be wrong. It could be picking up something. Like I had a patient who got so upset one day, like, you're giving me finally she said, you're giving me this expression. It's like, there's something under my contact. And, I was not doing that, but, there's something in my contact and I was trying to pay attention to that. She picked it up and she started saying, oh, I'm judging her. And I'm glad she could share that with me. She felt safe enough to share with me, because then she could start to see, she learned from that, like, what else am I picking up? What if somebody's having could be so many other things. And now what I learned is I could say, excuse me, there's something in my contact, and I could tell them, because the person could pick that up.
Right.
They don't know how to interpret it. So the healing response is really anything that's practicing on our posture, anything that helps our breath, singing, chanting, changing the intonation of our voice. I've had sessions with people who were very angry, and the only thing we did in the session is they had to say their story. I gave them like 5 minutes to tell them what they're angry about. Can you believe my wife did this? And I had them say the exact same words, but change their intonation. Can you believe my wife did that? Now, most people say, oh, so I shouldn't be mad at my wife? And I said, I'm not saying that at all. How would you like to be? Do you want to have a conversation about that with her? Do you want to orient it differently? Do you want to increase your blood pressure and have a heart attack? If you do, just get angry. I don't care.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I'm not saying we condemn or condone that, but how are you going to be while you're waiting? That's the practice.
Yeah, and so, to kind of sum up the top down, bottom up approach, what I said in a conversation we had last week is it's like a three-legged stool where there's thought, there's the feeling, and then there's posture. Like there's thought and feeling, but then there's also your body physically. And there are these studies showing, power poses and all this. When we sit upright, we feel more confident. When we slouch, we tend to not feel as confident. And so there are all of these, and you're going to love this, hacks that you can do. But I think those are
It's
all
called yoga. It's been around for
yeah.
5,000
So,
years, people.
right. So those are behavioral changes, and yoga also gets your diaphragm in a way where you can activate your vagus nerve. So those
Yeah.
are all things those are tools that we use to modify behavior. And I just want to touch on this orienting thing, because I really think that this is what it all goes back to for me is, what do you want? How do your question, right? The Brad question, how do you want to be? How do you want to live? How do you want to orient? And when you put your attention on that, everything else kind of will naturally shift. And so when I was in this stress state about doing this interview, and I had that moment of like, okay, how do I want to be? Well, like, I want to feel confident. Okay, if that's the case, then I can take this three-legged stool of thought and posture and feeling and help myself encourage my body to get into that state, if that makes sense.
Yes, exactly. A lot of, well, actually, most of what I do involves some breath work. My business is the breath space, so I teach people breathing. And sometimes, for some patients, all I'm doing is we're just working on the posture, because you have to have upright posture in order to breathe functionally. And then how we breathe and the relationship to the breath. And that's what I ask people. It's like, how does a confident, like maybe that word's triggering to some people, but how does a peaceful person who still is resilient, meaning they adapt to what's happening. They don't have to like it, like we talked about earlier. You don't have to like what's happening, but they want to adapt to it. How do they breathe? And then how is their posture? And how would they take in breath? Because a lot of us, the breath is such a metaphor. Like, I breathe this breath of fresh air, a sigh of relief. He was full of hot air. All of these things that we say about couldn't catch my breath. It really reflects our orientation.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you want to breathe? Breathe in life. Put yourself out in the world. So I do a lot with breath as a metaphor for that. And people seem to get it. And what everyone says to me, like the second session all the time, is, I didn't realize how much I'm holding my breath. Like, what are you waiting for?
And by the way, that, talking about the bottom up, just to drive this point home for everyone, are you angry or are you not breathing? Are you anxious or have you been sitting like this all day? And if we're sitting like this all day, not breathing or breathing shallow breaths, you are going to start to feel anxious. And
yes.
then the kind of cognitive mind goes in and tells a story. Oh, I must be anxious because of this, or and it kind of finds something to put meaning on. But really, it might be that the source of your anxiety may just be postural, or I say just be, but it may be breath, it may be posture, it may be the food that you ate, it may be the need for exercise. So there are, physical, our body does want flow, and it wants oxygen, and when we aren't giving it that, it's going to send a signal to our brain that something's not right.
And just back to what you just said, I heard food. When you eat a food to which you're allergic, you release histamine and serotonin, and that goes up to the brainstem, and it increases your breathing drive. So you start to breathe more rapidly, and just come on, everybody knows. Do you think you're going to be relaxed if you're going around? No, people get anxious when they watch me do that. And, we can get into a whole conversation about different breathing techniques that are out there. But when you do that rapid breathing, you're increasing your sympathetic nervous system. You're just like speeding up your heart rate. It speeds up your heart rate. You actually have more epinephrine and are able to do more activity. Not necessarily the functional way to do it.
So
But back to what you said.
you mentioned Lisa Feldman Barrett. Is that Feldman Barrett? What is
Yeah,
what is?
Lisa Feldman Barrett. Yes.
Yeah. In her book, Sam wanted me to tell the story. In her book, she tells a story about this guy in her lab asking her out on a date. This is to, she studies emotion. She's a PhD, studies emotion. That's her whole career. And so this guy in her lab was asking her out on a date, and she kept saying no to him.
Mm.
And she was like, I don't want to date a coworker, but he kind of kept pressing. And so eventually she agreed to go have coffee with him one day. And they went out and they had coffee. And as she was sitting across from him, she started noticing like butterflies in her stomach. And she was like, whoa, like I had no idea, like maybe I am attracted to this guy. Maybe there is something here that I just like, wow, I just wasn't seeing it this whole time. And so the coffee date ended. She goes home and she ends up with the stomach flu for 3 days. And so the point is, she was interpreting those internal sensations because of the context that she was in. She was interpreting her unease in her stomach as butterflies, when in fact it was a prodrome of having the stomach flu. And so, she ended up marrying someone else, and that wasn't a love connection.
So the take home for everyone is when you're on a date, if you feel butterflies, wait for a few days to see if you have stomach flu. That's the, but I love that story. I mean, I talk about if you exercise, if you haven't exercised for a while and you overexert yourself and the next day you wake up and you're sore and you go, uh-oh, what's wrong? Oh, I exercised. And then if you're like me, you go, aha, I exercised. Okay,
Yeah.
good. That's good sore. But then you wake up and you haven't exercised for a few weeks, or you've been doing the same thing, and all of a sudden you're really sore. It's like, oh my God, am I dying? Do I have the flu? Do I have the stomach flu? What's wrong? That's what we're constantly doing.
Yeah.
And we assign meaning to things. And I've said to so many of the patients I work with PTSD and panic attacks specifically, what if it's not a psychological issue? What if you just don't know how to breathe? Again, that's an education piece, which could be a reframe.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, wow, I'm hardwired to breathe more rapidly. I can work on that. That's something you can do.
And it's this notion also of cognitive reframing, like we were talking about before with, things that you're feeling is, remember there was a woman who came to 40 years of Zen. And as she, we did this thing at the beginning of every week at 40 years, we would have 5 new clients every week. And at the very beginning, first thing Monday morning, we would have all of them introduce themselves. And there was one client that came, and as she started introducing herself, she stopped and she said, I'm sorry, I'm just really nervous right now. I have social anxiety and I just get really nervous. And you stopped her in that moment and you said, are you nervous or are you excited? I don't think you said it in those words. You led her a little bit.
Yeah.
It just goes back to this, excited and nervous actually have the same signatures physiologically. Our heart rate goes up, our breathing changes. And so every time now that I feel nervous, I say to myself, am I nervous or am I just excited? Right? Because that's a reframe that you can, in the moment, just like you said, when you hear that it's the refrigerator and you know that it's not someone breaking into your house, the tension goes away and the cortisol will go away as well. And it's the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I had that. I think the very first time that I did that, because as you said, my favorite questions are, how do you want to be? How do you want to be in this moment? And just for, if some people don't know my background, as you said, I did a lot of hospice work. I did a lot of HIV care in the beginning of my career when my patients, those was before some medications, so it was considered a death sentence is what people will say. I didn't say that. But they knew that they had a few years left to live. And so I'm always asking people, how did you want to live those? And so that is my background. That's where I cut my teeth as a naturopath, really working with people about saying, okay, right now, and people would wait for their lab tests. I did oncology care. And while they're waiting for their PET scan results, they'd be so anxious, but they're nervous. So the first question I always ask is, how do you want to be? Do you know how that is? But I also ask, how do you know? Mm-hmm. Which is what we're talking about. How do you know? And I had a patient once who came in and long, complicated pregnancy history, several surgeries, miscarriages, but she came in and she was in her 3rd trimester. And she came in and quick story is that she said, I've been anxious this whole whole pregnancy. And, the first thing my mind said, well, of course you were. You had all these complications. And then I said, well, how do you know? And she started talking about, she was excited and she had this feeling and her whole affect changed and said, sounds like excitement. And she paused and looked at me and went, I'm excited. Oh my God, I'm excited. I'm going to have this baby. I'm excited. And she left. Shortest appointment I ever had. It was booked for an hour. It was shortest. And I told that story to my students, who then, one student told us at the end of the quarter, she said, you told me that story and it was so profound. And I thought, I've been in school my whole life. And I always tell myself I have test anxiety. And she said, what if I'm not anxious? I'm going to ask myself, what if I'm not anxious? I'm excited about taking a test. To which everybody rolled their eyes. You're not excited. And she said, and my test anxiety has been gone all quarter.
I was always very excited to take tests, by the way. I loved taking tests.
I never was excited about taking tests.
So now that we're coming up on the hour, believe it or not, which I cannot believe. So wow. Speaking to, I think that we've covered a lot, and speaking to what, and I hope that people here have found benefit, specifically with what's going on now, right? And I think that everything that we talked about, we can apply, and we talked about this a bit at the beginning with the uncertainty of what's going on, and a lot of people feeling just like, for me, even, I'm in a safe place. My job is safe, all just like you said. And I feel this kind of looming anxiety. And I just wonder if you have any.
Well, actually, yes, I wasn't going to say this before, but are you anxious or are you grieving? This is one of the things I've been pointing out, because I think the world, by we, are suffering from a pandemic of grief. Grief is not depression. Grief is not anxiety. Grief is loss. Loss of our day-to-day routine, loss of our connection with our loved ones, loss of just our identity because we used to do things. And I'm not saying it's good or bad, but grief is profound and needs to be welcomed in, like all emotions do, all emotions. Because the more we distance ourselves, this is the engagement with ourselves that I'm talking about. But if we really have grief and feel it, we understand that it's cyclical, it changes. And one minute we'll say, I'm safe here. But what's happening in the world? And so it's really just loss. We need to embrace it, or grief is going to become intractable, chronic state that it's going to be harder to deal with. So the first thing is, like you said in the beginning, be mindful, be willing to engage with whatever you're feeling, whether it is fear. Am I going to have a job? Am I going to have any security? Am I going to have, is my family going to be okay? To not fight it, because I think that whenever we suppress our emotions by avoiding them, they can become intensified. Like sadness can become major depression, fear can become terror, abject terror, frustration can become rage, even joy can become mania. And so to welcome them in and just say, what am I feeling? And remind ourselves that it's okay to feel that. That's engaging with our feelings. That's the very first thing. And then the compassion piece of that, which is simultaneously, I think, happening simultaneously, is saying, I'm human. Of course I feel this way, and to accept that in yourself, love that. And notice when you start to judge it, when you really start to criticize yourself for needing to be another way. I remember after 9/11, that day, at the time, my partner was in Belgium and couldn't get back, and was not in the, was in the French-speaking side. And so the news was on the TV and didn't understand anything. Said, what's happening? And called me up. And I still had patients that day. And I remember the very first patient I saw that day said to me, we can't let this get us down. We have to just act as everything is normal. And I said, I completely disagree. Nothing is normal. Nothing's ever normal. And to just really sit in that is not a sign of weakness. It's not a sign of vulnerability. It's just saying this is what is. And maybe that information will alter how we approach our world. So I'm throwing a bunch of other things out there, but
We're human is what I'm hearing. You're human, and the idea that you're never going to feel quote unquote negative emotion is, it's impossible to live that way. And so to just be with it, that's what I'm hearing. And I
yep.
know that sounds kind of watered down, but that's really it. If you
And I would even add no negative emotion. We're all going to have emotions.
Yeah, and Candace Pert said all emotion, all honest emotion is good emotion, right? So if it's honest, if it's what you feel, that's the first step. And so, Dr. Brad, I do have a question here that I think's good. And someone is asking if there's a way to change that how one responds to a traumatic event, because she's mentioning she always freezes. And if we can change our response, and that also fits in with however we're responding right now to this current grief.
Yes. And we do immobilize, and some immobilization is fun. At the end of the day, how many people say, okay, I'm just going to binge watch Netflix. I'm just, first of all, stop judging yourself. Really? I mean, how is that being kind to ourselves? And we need to immobilize, because the other thing is we're working too much. We're mobilizing way too much in our culture because we always think we have to be doing. And you're never doing nothing. You are never doing nothing. If you're sitting and looking out at the window and looking at the birds, you're sitting and looking at the birds. If you're sleeping, you're sleeping. You're never doing nothing. We need to reframe that language culturally. So when we want to rewire the nervous system, whether we're a chronic mobilizer or an immobilizer, we need to practice some skills in moments when we feel safe. To expect us to listen to this talk or go see somebody, and then when we start to immobilize and because we got triggered, to change it, it ain't going to happen. It's just like learning to knit, ride a bike, anything. Any of that. You don't expect the concert pianist to go to Carnegie Hall and play a new piece without practicing it. So that's also a cognitive reframe for us. So what I would say is practice times of learning how to regulate your nervous system. And I think the easiest one is the breath, because that's going to be, for me, it could be a mindfulness exercise. Actually, two things. It could be a breath work where you simply, if you can, you feel your pulse. And if you can feel your pulse, don't get too hung up on that. And you just try to, I would say, lay down on your back. Lay down on your back with your knees supported, feel your pulse, and just count the heartbeats, and just count like 4 in, 4 out. And then if you can, get to 5 in, 5 out without needing to take really deep breaths. And the reason is those exhales will get longer as you exhale, even for 5 beats. It's a 5, the heart slows down and you start to slow down the heartbeat. And that regulates the ventral vagus. It actually allows that vagus nerve to come back online. So breathing is really powerful. It's just breathing in. You could, if you don't want to feel your heartbeat, just count 4 seconds in, 6 seconds out, something like that. That could be a good practice. The mindfulness one, if you feel like you're immobilized, is just to grab something, feel something, get some kind of object. Everything is over there. And just practice mindfulness. Mindfulness doesn't mean closing your eyes and focusing on the breath. Mindfulness is being present to something without judgment or elaboration. So it's feeling the cup, getting into the sensations of touch, feeling it, and just being with the feeling. That's observing it without any verbal language. It's pre-verbal. You don't have to have verbal. But then you start to describe it. How would I describe it to someone who can't see, doesn't know what this is like? And that naming process is actually getting you out of the amygdala into part of the prefrontal cortex, cingulate, some other parts of the brain that are about interoception, about getting into the sensations of feeling. So those are 2 practices. I mean, you can do that with other senses as well, but you can do that in the midst of immobilization, but I would recommend practicing these at times when you can really dedicate to training.
So, in other words, don't wait until you feel unsafe to practice
Oh, don't.
safety.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that one of the, we want the quick pill, we want the quick fix. And one thing that I've had to have you drill into my head, because I'm a mobilizer and I want to do everything yesterday. For me to feel safe, I have to get a lot of stuff done. The thing that I have to keep reminding myself over and over again is it's a practice. I'm not just going to wake up one day and it's going to, my response is going to be different. So you have to practice every day. And I hope you guys are hearing this. This is not something that you just beat yourself up about when it shows up again. And then you went 2 weeks without practicing it. Right. So
Yep.
every day, spend 5 minutes practicing something.
Every athlete does that. The athletes will say, I've been seeing all the Instagram things of it. Some of my favorite athletes are saying, I'm doing this at home, and you still have to do it. Yeah. And you do it at home. And the athlete doesn't say, it's too cold outside. And it's like, it's cold outside, and I'm doing this because I have this goal of balancing my nervous system. And I think about the Dalai Lama. He still gets up at 4:30 in the morning, and in his Art of Happiness book, I believe he said, I meditate for 4 hours in the morning, contemplating how I want to be that day. And I'm sitting here going, you've been doing this long enough. You should get it already. You don't need to practice. It's contradictory to what I'm saying. Right. Yeah, you have to practice.
I think that's we're almost 5 minutes over. And I think that's a great place to, I think that's a great place to wrap up. So what I, in the gist of it, realize that whatever you're feeling right now is okay, because it is. So the first thing is to note, number one is to notice what you're feeling. Like, what is it really? And how do you know, as Dr. Brad said, how do you know you're feeling what you're feeling? Is it possible that you need to drink a glass of water? Is it possible that you need to go for a walk and that actually that is going to shift how you're feeling? So first of all, is it true what you're feeling? Secondly, if it is true, it's okay. And if you would like for it to be different, because that's not how you want to orient to life, practice how you want to be every day, regardless of if you feel great that day or if you feel triggered that day. And then over time, this is how you rewire your brain. It's not a magic fix, and it is, at the end of the day, up to you, and only you can do it.
And to remember to connect with other people. And don't think about your struggles as weaknesses, your suffering as weaknesses, because I think when you then reach out and say, hey, I'm having a hard time, and you don't have to, the other person doesn't have to fix it. If you're listening to other people, all you have to say is, yeah, I hear about your suffering. Yeah, I really care about you. That is healing. And I think more healing than when we try to fix it. Yeah. This has been fun.
Dr. Brad, thank you so much. Yeah. We could probably talk for another 2 hours, but we're going to thank you all so much who joined us.
Thank you
all. We're going to, we're hopefully recorded this and going to send it out so more people can listen. And thank you all so much. Okay, Dr. Brad.
Take care, everyone.
Take care.
Go gently, knowing your goodness.